At what point did the talks with the National Space Institute begin that led to the merger into the National Space Society?
Well, I was attempting to build up the L5 Society, and so I had done one merger after another with smaller groups. And the idea was basically to get close to monopoly and all the sort of localized grassroots groups that existed at the time. And so I did 6 of these, and then I got to the 7th, which was, I thought, a merger might make sense with the National Space Institute. So I called them up and suggested it to them, and they thought about it for a while. And the original executive director at the time, Mark Chartrand, wasn't that excited about it. But then they got a new executive director, Glenn Wilson, and he liked the idea. So we started talking about it. It took about 3 years to do the merger, and I did the vast majority of the negotiating for the L5 side. And it was really consuming. I mean, for particularly the last 2 years, I think the only thing Glenn Wilson did, or I did that had anything to do with space, was merger stuff. And there's endless, we had this merger document that you had to create legally, most of which was the bylaws for the new organization. And we went through that stuff line by line ad nauseum. We eventually hired a lawyer who was very competent in this field and was giving us a relatively low price because he liked us. It still cost us like $30,000 to help out and answer all our questions and go through the final document quite a bit. But it was very difficult negotiation because the culture of the L5 Society was basically like grassroots movement. And the National Space Institute was this very establishment organization, and originally created by Wernher von Braun, and they had was the sort of the establishment credentials. They had connections to aerospace companies, and they had a good reputation as being reasonable people. And we had, however, all kinds of activist vigor. We had lots of volunteers, lots of people who wanted to go out and do stuff, which they didn't have. And we also had built up a substantial political grassroots capability for lobbying, which they liked. And more important, the aerospace companies liked that because they needed help then, particularly with the space station. And they sort of facilitated the merger by making it clear that they would donate some money to the if the merger occurred. And that was, so there's really sort of 3 parts going on in the merger. Eventually, we got an agreement, which occurred in 1987, 3 years after it started, and that's how the organization, National Space Society, started.
So what have been some of the highlights of your experiences working for with the NSS and serving on the board?
Well, one of the highlights in the early days, which was actually in L5 Society, 1979, was we went and defeated the Moon Treaty. And this was fairly amazing. I'm going to rephrase that. It was amazing because the Moon Treaty had been negotiated over a long period of time, 10, 15 years in the United Nations. And they had to get basically agreement of all the major powers. And one of the last holdouts of any significance turned out to be the Soviet Union. And the Soviets didn't like the fact that one of the things the Moon Treaty did is basically say nobody can have sovereignty over anything, any celestial body beyond the Earth, and various other things. And it was the United States that was pushing all this common heritage ideas, which are really fairly socialist, which is sort of weird. But eventually the Soviets came around because the United States kept, beating them up by going to the third world and saying, we're trying to do this for all of humanity, and you guys, and the Soviet Union is evil because they won't give you all the goodies that, in some sense, we're giving you. And so finally, the Soviet Union went for it. And it was agreed to the UN, which then meant the treaty had to be ratified by various powers. In our case, it had to go back and be ratified by the Senate. Well, at that point, we decided that this would be horrible, because one of the things that the treaty did was basically prevent private enterprise from doing anything on any of these celestial bodies. So basically, and it was really Keith Henson more than anybody else, who was president of the society at the time, and he convinced the board, against some resistance, to pretty much bet the organization on defeating this treaty. So he went out and we hired a high-powered lawyer in Washington, D.C., who was a lobbyist who had been lobbying against the Law of the Sea Treaty, which was very similar, except it was against the sea, about the sea. And he gave us a low price because he understood that if he could defeat the Moon Treaty, then he could use that fact to put pressure against the Law of the Sea Treaty. So he started working on the Hill, and we organized all our grassroots stuff. And I was in charge of organizing the grassroots stuff, and we developed, among a lot of other things, a phone tree which ran through the entire membership, and which was later expanded to include other people. And we had this huge fight, and in the end, we won. And the Moon Treaty was not ratified by the United States, and it's never been ratified by the United States. And so that was cool.
Did the other nations in the UN ratify that? And does that mean that we could claim ownership and sovereignty if we choose to?
Very slowly after that, a few nations every once in a while have ratified the treaty. There's it takes, I think, 5 before the treaty comes into effect, but it only affects those nations which ratify it. There's now about 7. So for those 7 countries, none of which are important space-wise, except I believe France, but nobody else has. And I'm reasonably confident that that treaty isn't going to go anywhere. But technically it is in force. Now, that happened like years after the original battle, because they'd been slowly ratifying it. Interesting enough, a couple of years later, we got the CIA came by, no, it's the FBI. The FBI came by our office and wanted to know why the Russian embassy was getting a copy of our publication, L5 News. And they walked in the door, and nobody expected them to come in, and we had very little money in those days, so our office workers were, pretty far down on the socioeconomic status. And so these guys walk in and say, "We're from the FBI, and we want to know, why is this thing going to the embassy?" And so these guys got all flustered. "What do you mean? We didn't do anything." "Okay, well, look it up." So they pull out the records, which in those days were these long sheets of computer paper that have page after page, and so they go through, about 10, 15 pages, nervous and whatnot. The FBI guys were looking at them like FBI guys look at people when they want to intimidate them. And finally they get to the place for the Soviet Union, which they should have gotten to in about 3 minutes, but by this time it was like 15 minutes. And they say, "Oh, okay, here it is." Because they paid $20 dues. And that was the end of that. We learned later that the KGB had been given the job of trying to figure out how the L5 Society could defeat the Moon Treaty when the Soviet Union couldn't. And that was the real reason that they were getting that they bought a membership.